The old farmers used to say the cold on the frontier could test a man's soul faster than any gun ever could, and on the night Caleb Whitmore found the girl on his fence, the cold felt like it had teeth. The wind had been blowing across the valley since sundown, sliding through the broken boards of Caleb's barn and rattling the windows of his small cabin like a warning no one could quite hear. It was the kind of Montana night that froze the breath before it left your mouth and turned every shadow in the snow into something that might be alive. Caleb Whitmore had lived alone on that stretch of land for 6 winters, and in that time, he had learned 2 simple truths about the frontier. The land was patient, and the cold never forgave mistakes. That evening he had stepped outside just after midnight, pulling his old wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked the short distance from the barn back toward the cabin, boots crunching against the crust of frozen snow. His horses were quiet, the cattle were huddled close to the fence line, and the sky above the valley was clear enough that the stars looked like ice scattered across black glass. Everything felt still, too still, and that was when he saw it. At first Caleb thought it was just a piece of cloth caught on the fence post near the edge of his property, something blown there by the wind during the storm earlier that evening. But as he walked closer, the shape shifted slightly against the wooden rails. Not cloth. A person. The figure was slumped against the fence, half buried in drifting snow, one hand gripping the top rail as if it had been the last thing holding her upright. Caleb stopped 20 feet away, the cold air burning in his lungs as he stared across the pale moonlight. It was a girl. Young, maybe 20 at most. Her dark hair was stiff with frost, strands of it frozen against her coat and cheeks. The coat itself was thin, far too thin for a night like this, and the wind pushed against her like it was trying to finish the job the cold had started. For a long moment Caleb didn't move. Out here, a man learned not to rush into other people's troubles. The frontier had a way of punishing men who got involved in things that weren't theirs. He had seen it before, too many times, but something about the way her hand still clutched the fence rail made his chest tighten. She hadn't collapsed completely. Not yet. The snow around her boots showed a trail of uneven steps stretching across the open field toward his property, a path that must have been nearly half a mile long through waist-deep drifts. Whoever she was, she had walked through a storm just to reach that fence. Caleb stepped closer. The wind shifted and carried the faint scent of wood smoke from his cabin across the field. The girl stirred slightly, as if her body had recognized the warmth somewhere nearby. Her eyes opened slowly, dark and unfocused at first, then locking onto Caleb's silhouette standing against the pale glow of the cabin lantern behind him. There was fear in those eyes, but there was something else too. Relief. Her voice came out barely stronger than the wind scraping across the snow. Please, just one word. Caleb glanced back toward the empty valley, scanning the dark ridges that surrounded his land. No lanterns, no riders, no sound except the long whisper of wind across frozen grass. Still, something about the way the girl had run all the way to his fence made the quiet feel heavier than it should have. He stepped forward until he stood just a few feet away from her. In the moonlight, he could see the detail he had missed from a distance. Around her wrist was a thin leather bracelet decorated with small turquoise beads arranged in patterns Caleb had seen only a few times before. Apache work. His jaw tightened slightly. The frontier had rules, even the unwritten ones. And one of the oldest said a man should think twice before stepping into the affairs of a tribe. The girl's fingers loosened slightly on the fence rail as the cold tried to pull her back into the snow. Caleb watched her for another long second. The wind cut through the valley again, sharper this time, and the girl's shoulders trembled under the thin coat. The old farmers used to say the land watched everything a man did out here. Every choice. Every moment he decided whether to walk away or stay. Caleb Whitmore exhaled slowly, the frost from his breath drifting into the night air like smoke. Then he took the last step forward. Caleb Whitmore had carried sacks of grain heavier than most men would ever try to lift, but the girl leaning against his fence felt lighter than the silence of that frozen valley. When he reached her, the wind pressed harder against them both as if it did not approve of the decision he had just made. Up close, the cold had already painted her face a pale shade beneath the frost that clung to her eyelashes. Her breathing was shallow, slow, each breath rising into the air like a thin ghost before disappearing into the dark. Caleb rested one gloved hand against the wooden rail beside her and looked again across the valley behind her trail. The snow stretched wide and empty under the moon, the long drifts untouched except for the uneven footprints she had left behind. Whoever she was, she had walked alone through nearly half a mile of open field in the middle of a mountain storm. People did not do that unless they were running from something or running toward the only place they believed might save them. The frontier had taught Caleb that both reasons were dangerous. The girl's fingers slipped slightly from the fence rail, and her body sagged forward a few inches before he caught her by the arm. The fabric of her coat was stiff with frozen snow. When he lifted her hand gently away from the wood, he saw that her knuckles were pale and trembling from the cold. She tried to stand straighter, but her legs did not answer the command. Her eyes stayed fixed on his face like she was measuring whether he would help or leave her where she stood. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind sighed through the broken boards of the barn again, and somewhere inside the stable one of Caleb's horses shifted its hooves against the frozen ground. The girl swallowed slowly, as if gathering the strength to speak again. Her voice was still weak, but clearer now. She said that she could not stay out here. She said that if the cold stayed any longer it would finish what the storm had started. Caleb glanced once more toward the hills that surrounded the valley. No lantern light flickered among the ridges. No sound of hooves drifted through the night air. Just the quiet weight of winter pressing down across the land. He knew what the old ranchers would say about this moment. They would say that a man who lived alone needed to stay clear of other people's troubles. They would say the frontier already had enough ghosts without inviting new ones onto your land. But Caleb Whitmore had also learned something else during the years he had spent carving a life out of that stubborn soil. Sometimes the land watched not to judge a man for the mistakes he made, but to see whether he remembered how to be human when the moment demanded it. The girl's grip tightened weakly around the sleeve of his coat. Her eyes searched his again, darker now with something close to fear. She whispered that if he left her there, she would not last until morning. The words hung in the cold air between them. Caleb let out a long breath that turned into frost as soon as it left his mouth. Then he moved. Carefully, he slipped one arm around her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her away from the fence as gently as he could. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, like the wind itself had hollowed her out during that long walk through the snow. Her head rested against the rough wool of his coat, and for the first time since he had seen her, she closed her eyes again, not from weakness, but from the quiet relief of warmth beginning to reach her through the layers of frozen fabric. Caleb turned toward the cabin, the lantern by the door glowing softly across the field. Each step across the snow left deep prints behind him as he carried her through the wind toward the only fire burning for miles across that valley. And somewhere beyond the frozen hills, far enough that the sound had not yet reached his land, a group of riders had already begun searching the dark. The warmth inside Caleb Whitmore's cabin felt almost unreal after the sharp bite of the wind outside. The small iron stove in the corner had been burning since sunset, filling the one-room cabin with the steady scent of pine smoke and dry wood. When Caleb pushed the door open with his shoulder, the lantern hanging beside the doorway swung slightly and spilled a circle of yellow light across the floorboards. Snow fell from his boots in heavy clumps as he stepped inside, carrying the girl across the room and closing the door behind him with his heel. The storm wind struck the wooden boards once more and then faded into a distant howl outside, leaving the quiet crackle of fire and the slow ticking of the stovepipe warming against the cold air. Caleb lowered her carefully onto the old wool blanket spread across the small couch near the stove. The warmth reached her slowly at first, like sunlight returning after a long night. Her coat was still stiff with frozen snow, and Caleb moved with patient hands, brushing the ice from the fabric and laying another blanket across her shoulders. He kept a careful distance, working quietly, the way a man does when he is not sure if a stranger trusts him yet. The girl's eyes opened again as the heat from the stove touched her face. For a moment she seemed confused, staring at the ceiling beams as if she had expected to wake beneath the open sky instead of inside a cabin. Then her gaze turned toward the fire, and the soft glow reflected in her dark eyes. She breathed in slowly, deeper this time, the warmth settling into her chest. Caleb stepped toward the small wooden table and poured water from a metal kettle that had been sitting near the stove. Steam curled into the air as he filled a tin cup and carried it back toward her. When he offered it, she hesitated only for a second before wrapping both hands around the warm metal. The heat made her fingers tremble slightly as feeling began to return. She drank slowly, each sip careful and quiet. The cabin held the kind of silence that belonged to places far from towns and roads. Outside, the valley stretched for miles under the moon, but inside that small room the only sound was the fire shifting inside the stove. After a few minutes the color began to return faintly to her face. She looked around the cabin, studying the rough wood walls, the tools hanging neatly beside the door, the stack of split logs waiting beside the stove. Her eyes finally returned to Caleb, who stood near the window watching the dark valley beyond the glass. When she spoke again her voice carried more strength than before, though it was still soft from the cold. She said that she had not expected anyone to live this far out in the valley. Caleb gave a quiet shrug without turning from the window. He said that most people preferred towns, but he preferred quiet land and honest soil. The girl nodded slowly as if that answer made sense to her. For a moment, she studied the leather bracelet still wrapped around her wrist, the small turquoise beads catching the glow from the fire. Caleb noticed the way her expression shifted when she looked at it, like the bracelet carried more weight than the thin cord suggested. He turned back toward her and asked the question that had been waiting since the moment he saw her trail across the snow. He asked how far she had walked through the storm to reach his fence. The girl stared at the fire before answering. She said that she had walked since the sun disappeared behind the western hills, nearly 6 miles through snow that reached her knees. Caleb felt the quiet weight of those words settle into the room. 6 miles through a Montana winter storm was not something a person survived easily. He asked why she had chosen his land out of all the empty valley. Her eyes lifted to meet his again, steady now despite the long night she had endured. She said she had seen the lantern burning in his window while the storm clouds were still moving across the mountains. She said it had looked like the only light left in the valley. Caleb studied her for a long moment, the fire reflecting across the wooden floor between them. Finally, he asked the question that mattered more than distance or storms. He asked who she had been running from. The girl's fingers tightened slightly around the warm tin cup. For the first time since entering the cabin, her gaze drifted toward the door, as if the cold darkness outside might still be listening. Then she looked back at Caleb and spoke quietly, choosing each word with care. She said that the people searching for her were not strangers. She said they were her own tribe. Caleb Whitmore had expected many answers when he asked that question, but he had not expected that one. The girl's words seemed to settle into the cabin like cold air, slipping under a door. Her tribe. For a long moment Caleb said nothing. The fire in the iron stove shifted and cracked softly, sending a small shower of sparks behind the stove door before settling again. Outside, the wind moved slowly across the valley, brushing against the cabin walls like a distant whisper. Caleb had lived on the frontier long enough to know that tribes did not search for their own people without reason. He walked to the window again and looked across the dark snowfields stretching toward the mountains. The valley remained quiet, but the kind of quiet that made a man listen harder than usual. Behind him, the girl lowered the tin cup onto the small wooden table beside the couch. Her hands had stopped trembling now, though the memory of the cold still lingered in the stiffness of her fingers. Caleb turned back toward her, studying her carefully. The firelight moved across the turquoise beads on her bracelet, the same bracelet he had noticed near the fence. Up close he could see the detail in the beadwork, the careful pattern woven through the leather cord. It was not something made quickly. It was something carried with meaning. He asked her name then, keeping his voice calm and steady. The girl lifted her eyes toward him and answered without hesitation. She said her name was Lena Redbird. Caleb nodded once, letting the name settle into the room. He said his name was Caleb Whitmore, and that the land outside those walls belonged to no one but the wind and the seasons. Lena studied him quietly for a moment, as if deciding how much of her story could be trusted in a stranger's cabin. The fire reflected softly in her eyes, turning them darker and deeper than before. Caleb pulled a chair closer to the stove and sat down slowly, resting his forearms on his knees. He asked the question again, though this time with a different weight behind it. He asked why her own people would be searching for her in the middle of a winter storm. Lena looked down at the bracelet around her wrist again before answering. She explained that she had not meant to leave her tribe the way she had. She said the storm had come down from the mountains faster than anyone expected. The wind had turned the trails into white emptiness, and the valley paths had disappeared under the snow. She had tried to return before nightfall, but the storm had swallowed the land around her. Caleb listened carefully, but something about the way she chose her words told him there was more to the story. People did not walk 6 miles through a blizzard just because they lost a trail. Still, he did not press her further. The frontier had taught him another lesson over the years. Sometimes the truth arrived in pieces, not all at once. Lena lifted her head again and looked toward the door as if she could see through the wooden boards into the frozen valley outside. She said that when the storm began to clear, she had seen distant lanterns moving along the ridges. Riders from her tribe searching the valley. She said they would not stop searching until they found her. Caleb leaned back slightly in the chair, considering that riders in winter could cover ground quickly if they followed fresh tracks, and her trail across the open field would not remain hidden once daylight reached the valley. The snow had preserved every step she had taken. The fire shifted again inside the stove, sending another quiet crack through the cabin. Lena's voice softened as she spoke again. She said she had not meant to bring trouble to his door. She said she had only followed the one lantern she could see through the storm and hoped that whoever lived there might allow her to warm herself for a little while before she continued on her way. Caleb watched her carefully as she said that. The words sounded honest, but the storm had already erased any easy path she might have taken. Outside, the wind had begun to settle, and the valley was growing quieter with each passing minute. Caleb stood slowly and added another split log to the stove, the flames rising slightly as the dry wood caught fire. When he turned back toward Lena, he spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who understood winter better than most. He said that no one walked anywhere in that valley until morning when the light returned. Lena looked toward the window again, toward the long darkness waiting outside the cabin walls. Neither of them noticed that the storm clouds had begun to drift away from the mountains, revealing a pale moon rising slowly over the frozen land. The fire inside Caleb Whitmore's cabin burned steady through the deep hours of the night, its orange glow stretching across the wooden floorboards while the iron stove ticked softly as the metal expanded with heat. Outside, the storm had begun to fade, but the cold remained sharp enough that frost slowly crept along the edges of the cabin windows like thin white branches. Caleb sat quietly near the stove, his chair tilted back slightly against the wall, listening to the quiet sounds of the valley beyond the glass. Years of living alone had sharpened his ears to the language of the land. The wind, the snow shifting, the distant movement of animals across frozen ground. Most nights the valley spoke in gentle whispers that carried no warning. But tonight the silence felt heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. Across the room, Lena Redbird rested beneath the thick wool blankets Caleb had placed over her shoulders. The warmth from the stove had slowly brought color back to her face, and her breathing had grown steadier with each passing minute. She had tried to stay awake at first, watching the fire and listening to the wind beyond the walls, but exhaustion had eventually pulled her into sleep. Her journey through the storm had drained every ounce of strength she had left. Caleb glanced toward her from time to time, making sure the heat of the stove remained strong enough to keep the cabin warm. The small lantern beside the table cast a soft golden light across the room, illuminating the turquoise beads on the bracelet still wrapped around her wrist. Even in sleep, her fingers rested lightly against it, as if the small piece of leather carried more comfort than the blankets themselves. The hours moved slowly across the night. At one point, Caleb stood and stepped quietly to the door, opening it just enough to look across the valley. The wind had settled now, leaving the snowfields still and pale under the moon. The storm clouds had drifted farther east, exposing a sky filled with bright winter stars. The land looked calm again, but Caleb knew better than to trust calm too easily. Fresh snow held stories like a page waiting to be read at sunrise. Every track across the valley would reveal itself once daylight returned. He closed the door and stepped back toward the fire. For a long while nothing changed. The stove crackled. The lantern flickered gently. The valley slept beneath the moon. Then sometime deep in the night, when the quiet had grown so complete that even the horses in the barn had stopped shifting in their stalls, Caleb heard something that did not belong to the wind. A sound far away, soft at first, almost too faint to notice. Caleb stood slowly from his chair and turned toward the window. The sound came again, carried across the frozen air from somewhere beyond the western ridges. Hooves. Not one horse. Many. The rhythm of them traveled faintly across the valley floor like distant thunder rolling through the mountains. Caleb did not move for several seconds. He simply listened, measuring the distance by the steady cadence echoing through the cold night air. Riders could cover ground quickly on frozen snow if they knew where to look. And Lena's trail across the open field would still be waiting there beneath the moonlight. Behind him, Lena stirred slightly beneath the blankets, her brow tightening as if her body had sensed the same sound drifting across the valley. Caleb stepped closer to the window and looked toward the dark hills where the sound had begun. At first he saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then far beyond the valley floor, small points of light began to appear along the ridge. Lanterns, moving slowly across the mountainside. Caleb exhaled quietly, his breath fogging the cold glass of the window. Riders searching the land always carried lanterns in winter storms. He counted them carefully as they moved across the ridge. 1, 2, 5. More appearing behind the first. The distant line of lights moved with calm purpose, spreading slowly along the ridge, as if the men carrying them already knew which direction to follow. Caleb turned his head slightly and glanced toward the sleeping girl across the room. The quiet warmth of the cabin had hidden the world from her for a few precious hours. But the valley outside had begun to wake again. And somewhere beyond those frozen hills, the search for Lena Redbird had already reached the edge of Caleb Whitmore's land. Caleb Whitmore remained standing beside the window long after the lantern lights appeared along the ridge, his eyes following the slow movement of those distant riders as they spread across the snowy horizon. The valley between the mountains and his cabin stretched nearly 2 miles wide, a silent ocean of white where every sound carried farther than it should. On a night like this, a man could hear a horse from half a mile away, sometimes more if the wind moved in the right direction. Caleb had learned that the first winter he spent on this land, when a passing rancher's horse had woken him from sleep even though the rider never came closer than the far side of the valley. Tonight the air carried the same sharp clarity. The hooves he had heard earlier had grown faint again, but the lanterns on the ridge told the rest of the story. Whoever those riders were, they had not turned back. They were spreading out, following the snow. Behind him the fire continued to burn steadily in the iron stove, pushing warm air through the small cabin. Lena Redbird shifted beneath the blankets again and slowly opened her eyes. The warmth had returned to her face, but the exhaustion of the storm still lingered in the slow way she moved. She looked around the cabin for a moment as if she needed to remember where she was. Then her gaze found Caleb standing at the window. She followed the direction of his eyes and noticed the change in his posture immediately. Something outside had his attention. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. The movement caused the turquoise beads on her bracelet to catch the lantern light again, a faint glimmer against the leather cord. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, but it carried enough strength now that the words reached him clearly. She asked if someone had come. Caleb did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the window and wiped a thin layer of frost from the glass with the back of his hand. The lantern lights were clearer now. There were more of them than he had first thought. They moved carefully along the ridge, descending slowly toward the valley floor like stars sliding down the mountainside. Caleb counted again. At least 20 riders. Maybe more beyond the line he could see. He turned slightly toward Lena and nodded once. He said that riders were moving along the western ridge. Lena's expression changed the moment she heard those words. The quiet relief she had felt inside the warm cabin faded into something more alert. She swung her legs slowly off the couch and stood, though the long night had left her unsteady for a moment. Caleb stepped away from the window as she approached, giving her space to look outside. When Lena reached the glass, she did not need long to understand what she was seeing. Her eyes followed the lanterns the same way Caleb's had. She recognized the pattern immediately. Search riders. They were spreading across the valley in a wide line, moving slowly so that none of the ground would be missed once the morning light returned. Lena's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She whispered that they had come sooner than she expected. Caleb leaned against the wall beside the window, his arms folded loosely as he watched the distant lights continue their steady descent toward the valley floor. He said that snow made tracking easy once the storm cleared. Every step she had taken across the field would still be waiting out there. Lena remained silent for a moment, studying the ridge carefully. The lanterns continued to drift lower along the mountain path, their glow reflecting faintly against the snow. The riders moved with patience, the way people did when they knew they had time on their side. Dawn would arrive in only a few hours, and daylight would reveal the valley in full. Lena turned back toward Caleb slowly. The quiet in the cabin felt heavier now than it had earlier in the night. She said that when the sun came up the riders would see the trail leading straight to his fence. Caleb nodded once. The truth of that statement required no debate. The snow outside had recorded every step of her journey. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire continued to crackle softly behind them, the warm light flickering across the wooden walls. Finally Caleb pushed himself away from the wall and stepped toward the stove, placing another piece of wood onto the coals. The flames rose slightly as the log caught fire. He said that morning would answer many questions once the valley could be seen clearly. Lena watched him quietly as he closed the stove door again. Then she asked the one question that had been waiting since she saw the lanterns on the ridge. She asked whether he planned to send her away before the riders reached his land. Caleb paused for a moment beside the stove. Outside, the lantern lights continued their slow descent through the darkness. The valley was still silent, but the coming dawn was already beginning to press against the horizon. Caleb Whitmore did not answer Lena Redbird's question immediately. He stood beside the stove for a moment, watching the fire settle around the new log he had placed inside. The flames moved slowly along the dry wood, spreading warmth through the small cabin while the iron walls of the stove glowed faintly in the dim light. Outside, the valley remained quiet, but the distant lanterns continued to move down the ridge like a slow river of stars. Caleb knew that by sunrise those riders would reach the valley floor, and when they did the snow would tell them exactly where Lena had gone. He walked back toward the window and looked out again across the frozen land. The horizon had begun to change slightly, not with light yet, but with the faint suggestion that night was slowly losing its hold on the sky. The mountains along the eastern ridge were beginning to separate from the darkness, their outlines forming against the stars. Lena stood a few feet behind him, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She waited quietly for his answer, though the tension in her posture made it clear she already understood how little time remained before morning. Caleb studied the distant lanterns once more before finally speaking. He said that the snow outside would hold her trail no matter what they did now. Even if she left the cabin immediately, the riders would still find the path leading straight to his fence. Lena lowered her eyes slightly as she heard those words. She had known that truth already, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality settle deeper. Caleb continued calmly, explaining that Winterland had a memory longer than most men. A storm might cover tracks for a while, but once the sky cleared, the snow became a perfect record of everything that had crossed it. He turned away from the window and looked directly at her. His voice remained steady as he spoke the next words. He said that sending her back into the night would not erase the trail she had already left behind. It would only add another line across the valley for the riders to follow. Lena stood silently, absorbing what he was saying. The warmth of the cabin no longer felt as comforting as it had earlier. Beyond the wooden walls, the valley waited beneath the stars, and the riders were moving closer with every passing minute. She stepped closer to the window again and studied the lanterns along the ridge. They had moved lower now, spreading across the slope in a wide line that stretched nearly a mile from end to end. Whoever led those riders knew exactly how to search open country. Caleb spoke again, more quietly this time. He said that when morning arrived, the riders would follow the trail to his fence, and from there the story would depend on the choices made after sunrise. Lena slowly turned back toward him. The firelight reflected softly across her face, and for the first time since she arrived at the cabin her expression carried something other than exhaustion or fear. It carried uncertainty. She asked what he meant by that. Caleb walked toward the small table and poured another cup of warm water from the kettle, offering it to her. As she accepted the cup, he explained that people who came searching often expected to find trouble waiting for them. But sometimes they arrived to find something else entirely. Lena studied him carefully, trying to understand the quiet meaning behind his words. Caleb glanced once more toward the window where the lantern lights continued their slow descent. Then he looked back at her and said that when the riders reached his land, he would meet them outside like any man would meet visitors crossing his property. Lena held the warm cup in both hands, the steam rising slowly into the cabin air. She asked him why he would do that for someone he had only met a few hours earlier. Caleb gave a small shrug, the kind that belonged to men who had spent too many years listening to the wind across empty land. He said that winter had a way of reminding people that survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. Lena remained quiet after that. Outside, the lanterns moved steadily closer, and somewhere beyond the eastern mountains the first faint hint of dawn had begun to gather behind the frozen horizon. The first light of morning arrived slowly across the Montana Valley, spreading a pale silver glow over the frozen fields as the stars faded one by one behind the mountains. Caleb Whitmore had been awake the entire night, standing near the window while the dark sky gradually softened into the quiet gray of approaching dawn. The lanterns along the ridge were no longer small distant sparks. They had descended into the valley during the final hours of darkness, their riders spreading across the snow in a long quiet line that now stretched across nearly half the western horizon. The search had become patient and deliberate. Caleb could see the shapes of horses now, dark figures moving carefully through the snow as the riders followed the tracks carved across the field hours earlier. Behind him, Lena Redbird stood silently near the stove, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders while the warmth of the fire slowly faded into the cooler air of morning. The cabin felt different now that daylight had begun to press against the windows. Night had hidden the valley in darkness, but morning would reveal every detail the snow had preserved. Caleb watched the riders move closer, their horses stepping carefully across the frozen ground. Each one followed the trail without hesitation. The snow showed the path clearly. Lena stepped closer to the window beside him. She did not need to ask whether the riders had found the trail. From where they stood, it was easy to see the curved line of footprints stretching across the open field toward the fence where Caleb had first found her. The riders followed it slowly but with certainty, spreading out to either side, as if they expected the trail to change direction at any moment. Lena exhaled quietly as she watched them approach. There was no panic in her voice now, only the calm understanding that the search had reached its final stretch. She said that they would arrive within the hour. Caleb nodded slightly. The riders were less than half a mile away now. He could see the breath of their horses rising into the cold air as they crossed the valley floor. One rider at the center of the line carried no lantern now that the sun had begun to rise. Instead, he rode slightly ahead of the others, guiding the group with slow, steady movements. His posture was straight and calm, the way experienced leaders carried themselves when they already knew the outcome of the journey. Caleb studied that rider carefully. Something about the way the others followed him told Caleb that this man was not simply another searcher. Lena watched the same figure, and her expression changed subtly. She whispered that the man riding in front was Chief Iron Hawk. Caleb glanced at her briefly, but said nothing. Outside, the riders continued forward, their horses moving through the snow until they reached the edge of Caleb's land. The tracks leading from the fence toward the cabin remained clear across the field, untouched by wind or drifting snow. Chief Iron Hawk followed those prints with quiet patience, guiding his horse slowly across the final stretch of frozen ground. Within minutes, the group reached the fence line where Lena had collapsed hours earlier. The riders paused there, studying the snow and the marks left behind. Several of them looked toward the cabin standing alone in the center of the field, smoke still rising gently from the chimney. Caleb stepped away from the window then. He moved toward the door without rushing, pulling his coat from the wooden hook beside the wall. Lena watched him carefully as he wrapped the thick wool coat around his shoulders. She asked him what he intended to say when the riders reached the cabin. Caleb paused with his hand resting on the door handle. He glanced back toward her with the same calm expression he had carried all night. He said that sometimes words were less important than simple truth. Outside, the sound of hooves approached slowly across the snow. The riders had begun moving again, following the final stretch of tracks leading straight toward the cabin door. Caleb opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air as the first rider approached his land. The cold morning air wrapped around Caleb Whitmore the moment he stepped outside the cabin, the kind of sharp winter air that made every breath feel clear and heavy in the lungs. The snow across the valley glowed pale under the rising sun, and the quiet land stretched wide in every direction except the one now filled with riders. Chief Ironhawk approached at the front of the group, guiding his horse at a slow and measured pace, while the others followed behind him in a long silent line. None of the riders raised their voices. None hurried their horses. The only sound drifting across the frozen field was the steady rhythm of hooves pressing gently into the snow. Caleb walked a few steps away from the cabin door and stopped beside the path of footprints that still marked Lena Redbird's journey across the field. From where he stood, the tracks were perfectly clear, each step leading directly to the fence where he had found her during the storm. Chief Ironhawk brought his horse to a stop about 20 yards from the cabin. The other riders halted beside him, forming a quiet half-circle in the snow. For a moment no one spoke. The wind moved lightly across the valley, lifting a faint swirl of powder from the frozen ground. Caleb stood calmly with his hands resting at his sides, watching the man in front of him. Ironhawk studied the snow first, his eyes tracing the trail from the fence to the cabin door. Then his gaze lifted slowly toward Caleb. The chief nodded once in quiet understanding before guiding his horse forward another few steps. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm strength of someone used to being heard without raising his tone. He asked whether the girl who had crossed that field during the night was inside the cabin. Caleb answered simply that she was warm and safe. The words settled into the morning air without tension or challenge. Chief Ironhawk studied him for a moment longer. Then he glanced toward the cabin door just as Lena stepped outside. She had wrapped Caleb's spare coat around her shoulders, the heavy wool nearly reaching her knees. The turquoise bracelet still rested against her wrist, catching the soft light of the rising sun. When the riders saw her, several of them shifted slightly in their saddles, but none moved forward. Lena walked slowly across the snow until she stood a few steps beside Caleb. Her eyes met the chief's, and the long silence that followed carried the weight of many unspoken questions. Finally, Ironhawk nodded again, though this time the gesture carried something warmer than before. He said that the storm had scattered their riders through the mountains during the night, and they had feared the cold valley might claim one of their own. Lena answered quietly that the valley had not taken her because a man who lived there had opened his door when the storm closed every path. The chief turned his attention back to Caleb then. For several seconds, he simply studied the farmer standing alone in the snow. The rising sun reflected across the frozen field behind him, and smoke continued to drift gently from the cabin chimney. Finally, Ironhawk dismounted from his horse. The movement surprised several of the riders behind him, but none spoke. The chief walked forward across the snow until he stood only a few feet from Caleb. He placed one gloved hand over his chest in a respectful gesture before speaking again. He said that in the mountains a life saved during winter carried a weight greater than gold. Caleb nodded slightly, unsure how to respond to words like that. Ironhawk turned and spoke briefly to the riders behind him in his own language. Two of them guided their horses forward and carefully lowered several wrapped bundles into the snow beside the trail. Thick furs, dried meat, and leather sacks filled with grain. The riders stepped back once the items were placed. Ironhawk looked toward Caleb once more and said that kindness shown in winter was never forgotten by his people. Caleb glanced at the bundles resting in the snow, then back at the quiet riders spread across the valley. For a moment, he simply stood there listening to the wind brushing across the frozen land. Finally, he gave a small nod, the kind of nod a man gives when words are unnecessary. Lena looked between the two men and smiled softly. As the sun rose higher above the mountains, the riders began turning their horses back toward the western ridge. And for the first time since the storm had begun, the valley felt completely still again.